It roared with flame, but the room stayed cold and deadly. Welcome to Crimson Clues. I am your host, Antonio. Comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? Your messages always warm this space. Let's uncover the clues. If one must be murdered, and on reflection many people eventually are, there are certainly worse places to meet one's end than a drawing room in Dorset, panelled in faded oak and adorned with family portraits whose expressions range from constipated to vaguely accusatory. It was into just such a room that Lord Peter Wimsey was ushered, one blustery March afternoon, by a housekeeper with the sort of face that suggested she'd survived the siege of Leningrad and been disappointed by it. "The Colonel's in there." "My lord," she said, pronouncing the title as if it were an unpleasant dental condition, "though I doubt you'll get much out of him." "Dead men rarely offer useful conversation," said Lord Peter with the faintest of smiles, "but I'm told their fireplaces can be remarkably eloquent." This remark received no response. Mrs. Thrip, housekeeper and moral arbiter of the late Colonel Septimus Hales's residence, Grindleshaw Grange, merely nodded once and receded into the corridor like a ship backing into a fog bank. The room was chilly. Not in the ghostly or metaphorical sense, though there were certain Gothic embellishments, a tapestry featuring the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, whose grilling might have suggested warmth to the ironic observer, a crumbling taxidermied owl, and a set of dusty fire irons that looked ceremonial rather than practical. No, it was physically cold, despite the wide old-fashioned hearth yawning open in the centre of the eastern wall. Lord Peter peered into the fireplace. There was a small ashen heap in the grate, barely disturbed. A dog-eared book of matches lay on the fender unused. The logs stacked in the copper scuttle were dry and scentless. "Curious," he murmured. "A fireplace one could stage a romance around. Lady Jane Grey, say, or a demoniac invocation, and yet no attempt at combustion. And on such a beastly afternoon." He turned slowly, surveying the rest of the room. On a winged settee, horsehair stuffing peeking from a tear in the upholstery, reclined the figure of a man in his late 60s, neatly dressed, with a faint smell of lavender and boot polish about him. His expression was one of studied boredom, but the bullet hole just above his right ear rather gave the game away. Lord Peter approached, hands in his coat pockets, and knelt briefly to examine the man's feet. They were encased in stout woolen socks and, more tellingly, fur-lined slippers. A hot water bottle, half wrapped in a tea towel, rested near one ankle. "I dare say, old thing," said Wimsey conversationally. "You were very cold indeed." There was no sign of a gun nearby. Nor was there blood on the carpet, which was a rather fine aubusson depicting a pair of stags jousting under the patronage of a distant chateau. Behind the body, the window had been latched. Outside, one could hear the waves slapping the chalky cliffs below the garden, a sound both desolate and gently mocking. Presently a voice entered the room along with the figure of Inspector Todd of the local constabulary. A burly reddish man who looked as if he'd been carved from beef and then dressed by a wife with high expectations. He nodded at Wimsey with cautious respect. "Thought you'd like a look, my lord," said Todd. "Dr. Crispin said time. Of death likely late last night. No suicide note, no weapon, no sign of a struggle. Room was locked from the inside. Key in the Colonel's pocket. Only him in the house overnight. We were called in by the cleaner this morning. Thought it odd. He hadn't let her in for her usual Tuesday dusting." "Ah," said Wimsey. "Domestic routines, so often the undoing of murderers and misanthropes alike." "Any relatives?" "Two nieces. One's in Devon, married to a clergyman, the other's something in the dramatic arts, stage manager or some such. We're still tracking her down. There's also a man, Mr. Otley, who calls himself the Colonel's financial confidant, though what that means exactly." "It generally means the next name on the will," said Wimsey, picking up a book from the end table, Scotland, a Necrological History. "And the fireplace, Todd? Cold, I take it?" "Stone cold." Not lit for days, according to Mrs. Thrip. She says the Colonel was odd about fire, said he only lit it when he was certain he wouldn't fall asleep in front of it. Claimed dreams came to him through the hearth. Whimsy raised one expressive eyebrow. A touch of the poetic or the paranoiac. Either way, the scene is a trifle performed, don't you think? I beg your pardon, my lord. I mean, to say if one were staging a death, one that seemed accidental or tragic or even impossible, it might be rather satisfying to do it in a room like this. With a body that hadn't bled, a hearth that hadn't burned, and a window that had seen the sea before it saw murder. Whimsy stood. Well then, he said, brushing off his trousers, let us pay a visit to the servants. They always know more than they're willing to tell. And the sooner I discover what didn't happen in this room last night, the sooner we may begin to understand what did. And with that, he swept out, pausing only to quote, to no one in particular, when the house is cold and the fire won't light, it may be the ghost or it may be the night. But when the dead man sleeps in the parlour seat, the fireplace tells you who turned down the heat. Lord Peter Whimsy descended the main staircase of Grindleshaw Grange with the air of a man engaged in a minor but fascinating taxonomical problem. Perhaps the precise classification of a moth whose wings resembled the marbled end papers of a Victorian novel. He tapped a fingernail absently against the banister, noting its craftsmanship, mahogany worn with the faint grease of generations clinging in the grooves. Age, it seemed, never quite let go of old houses. It merely settled in like a retired colonel and refused to leave. At the base of the stairs, Mrs. Thrip awaited him with all the enthusiasm of a woman confronted by a tax audit in her parlour. I presume the staff has been told to remain available for questioning? Asked Whimsy pleasantly. They've not gone far, my lord, not that they know anything, never do when it matters. Splendid. Let us begin with someone who knows nothing at all. It's the ignorance that interests me. She led him down a short corridor lined with watercolours of the Dorset coast in various shades of melancholy, and tapped on a green baize door before opening it to reveal a tidy servants' parlour. A thin young man in a black waistcoat stood up abruptly, brushing invisible dust from his trousers. His hair was neatly parted, and his face bore the bland, self-erasing expression typical of footmen who have survived 2 seasons without disgrace. "This is Edwin," said Mrs. Thrip, "Colonel's valet, or was." "Ah, Mr. Edwin," said Whimsy, sinking into a rather unforgiving chair. "Do sit down. I dislike towering over witnesses. It gives one a false sense of omniscience." Edwin perched nervously on the edge of a hard-seated bench. "You were the Colonel's personal servant, I understand. How long had you been in his employ?" "Just over 3 years, sir, my lord. Since his last valet, Mr. Price, retired with his lungs. Too much polishing of boots. Old gas heaters in the London house, sir. That and the soot." Whimsy inclined his head gravely. "And you've been here at Grindleshaw since?" "Since August last, my lord. The Colonel preferred the sea air for his rheumatics." "Did he indeed? And how was his mood, say, in the past month? Cheerful, brooding, inclined to quote Tennyson or hum in the bath?" Edwin blinked. "He didn't bathe as such, my lord. Preferred a hot sponge with lavender vinegar. Said tubs aggravated his joints, but he'd been odd lately." "Odd in what way?" "Edgy. He took to locking the library even when no one was about, and he asked me to check the window latches each night. Once or twice he asked whether I'd ever had dreams about fires." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Fires?" "Yes, sir. He said he'd dreamt of one in this very house, always in the same room, the drawing-room. He'd wake up thinking he could smell smoke, but of course nothing was ever there. Mrs. Thrip said it was nerves." "And the fireplace?" "Never lit it, sir. Said it smoked. Mrs. Thrip had the chimney swept, but it made no difference." "Did he use any other room for warmth?" "Sometimes the study. He had a paraffin heater, but he didn't like to sit still long." walked up and down the hallways, or read by the window. Whimsy tapped his chin. And last night? I helped him undress around 10. He said he'd be reading a while and not to wait up. That was the last I saw him. Did he seem, well, final? I don't think he was suicidal, if that's what you mean, my lord. He'd ordered new boots for spring and asked me to repress his white cravat for Sunday. Seemed quite himself. Then let us accept for the moment that he had no intent to die. That makes the bullet all the more inconvenient. Thank you, Edwin. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, send word at once. As Edwin nodded and retreated, Whimsy turned to Mrs. Thrip. Was there anyone else in the house last night? Just Edwin, myself, and the Colonel. The rest of the staff live out. Kitchen maid, gardener, laundrywoman, no visitors expected, though— Yes? She hesitated, twisting the ring on her left hand. Well, the telephone rang about 11:15. I was in bed by then, but I heard it through the wall. The Colonel answered it himself. I couldn't hear what was said, only that it wasn't a short call. Afterward he paced for a while. Heavy steps. Interesting. And who would be calling at such a socially irregular hour? I couldn't say, but he didn't sleep after that, I know. He went down to the drawing room. And did you hear a shot? No, my lord, nothing. But the wind off the sea was dreadful last night, howling like mad. It had drowned out a drum corps. Whimsy nodded. The pieces, though still cloudy, were beginning to take shape. A fire never lit. Dreams of smoke, a telephone call in the night, and a dead man in slippers with no blood on the carpet. He next interviewed the cook, a nervous woman whose greatest trauma appeared to be the late Colonel's distaste for root vegetables, and the gardener, a deaf gentleman who could name every shrub in the grounds, but thought bullets were a sort of pest spray. Neither offered anything useful, except for the gardener's aside that someone been walking the rose path near midnight. Fresh prints this morning, Mrs. said. Boots? Asked Whimsy. No. Shoes. Men's, I think. Light tread. A man in shoes out walking in the dark, while the Colonel sat wide-eyed in a freezing room. He returned to the drawing room and stood before the cold fireplace once more. The pile of ashes had been disturbed, minimally but enough to catch his eye. He knelt, taking a pencil from his pocket, and prodded gently. Not paper, nor coal. This was wood, yes, but not from the house stock. It was perfumed. He sniffed. Cedar wood? No. Something more artificial. He stood, frowning. From the side table he picked up the matchbook he'd noticed earlier, embossed in cheap gilt. Hotel L'Estaminet Torquay. A seaside hotel of middling reputation, if memory served. Known. More for its champagne luncheons than for discretion. Whimsy turned the book in his fingers. 1 match gone, 9 remaining. He slipped it into his pocket. The Colonel had not lit the fire, but someone had been prepared to. He examined the windows again. The latch was stiff but functional. No sign of forced entry. But then, one did not need to break in when the front door stood metaphorically open. When a familiar face came calling, he turned to leave and paused, the portrait above the mantel. A grim-faced woman in widow's black, painted in the late Victorian style, clutching a sprig of rosemary. There was a ribbon affixed to the lower frame, Amelia Hales, 1840-1911. She watched the hearth. He studied it for a moment longer, then turned on his heel. Somewhere the Colonel's past was trying to whisper through the cracks of this cold house. Whimsy had only to listen and assemble the story from the echoes. The sea that afternoon was a particularly sullen grey, as though it too objected to death in a room where no fire burned. Lord Peter Whimsy stood for a moment on the back terrace of Grindleshaw Grange, coat flapping in the stiff coastal wind, and looked down the narrow rose path that wound along the edge of the cliff. It was barely visible now. The footprints, already softening under salt, mist and time. He squatted, knees cracking gently, and examined the damp earth. The gardener hadn't lied. Someone had indeed walked there recently. The tread was shallow, the stride even. No dragging, no signs of haste. The person had walked, not run. Perhaps thinking, perhaps talking, perhaps simply waiting. He rose and lit a Turkish cigarette with a quiet snap of his lighter. Smoke curled away in thin spirals. He did not smoke often, not since Harriet had issued one of her unanswerable gazes over the top of the Times literary supplement. But on occasion, he permitted himself the full Sherlock Holmes fantasy. After all, one had to keep one's wits oiled. Back inside, he located Inspector Todd, who had set up a temporary command post in the Colonel's study, surrounded by ledgers, estate maps, and a tepid pot of tea that had clearly lost the will to live. "Inspector," Wimsey said, "tell me, do we know anything more about this Otley fellow?" "Just rang in, actually," Todd replied, flipping open a notebook. "Frank Otley, business partner of the Colonel from his London days. Investment schemes mostly, some to do with wartime logistics, some post-war property. They'd remained in touch, though the Colonel had mostly retired. Otley says they last spoke a week ago, apparently about some inheritance business." "Inheritance?" "Colonel's will. Says the Colonel wanted to change it. Otley was going. They'd bring the forms down next week. Most inconsiderate of the Colonel to die in the meantime." "What about the nieces?" "One en route from Devon, Mrs. Amelia Throssell, formerly Hales. Her sister, Miss Georgina Hales, hasn't been located yet. Some mention of a touring theatre company. You know the type." Wimsey did, though he reserved judgment. Touring theatricals often made excellent dinner guests and even better murder suspects. "Have you checked the Colonel's correspondence?" "We've gone through what's in the study. No drafts of a new will, no letters dated after last Thursday." Wimsey reached into his coat pocket and produced the matchbook. "Have a look at this, would you?" "Found it in the drawing. Room, one match missing." Todd examined it, frowning. "Hotel L'Estaminet, Torquay?" "Indeed. The place is known for its second-rate seafood and third-rate discretion. Might be worth ringing them. See who's registered recently. And another thing, the ashes in the fireplace. Not coal or paper. Something scented. Artificial. Not from the house, according to Mrs. Thripp." Todd jotted a note. "We'll get the lab to analyze what's left. Could be important." "It always is when it seems otherwise," Wimsey murmured. He excused himself and headed toward the Colonel's private quarters. The bedroom, by contrast to the drawing room, was oppressively warm, radiators humming, the air heavy with lavender. On the nightstand was a bottle of brandy unopened. A folded copy of The Field sat beside it, along with a pair of pince-nez, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a heavily annotated copy of The Inferno, marked at the lines, "Abandon all hope, ye who—" "Enter here." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "Bit melodramatic for Septimus Hales," he murmured, or perhaps a warning to himself. The wardrobe was neatly arranged, trousers pressed, shirts starched, boots polished to a military sheen. Yet something nagged. A drawer half open revealed a red velvet box containing several medals, none especially distinguished save one, a foreign decoration, rarely seen, the Croix de Guerre. Curious. Wimsey returned to the study, where Todd was now frowning at a single sheet of yellowing foolscap. "Found something?" Wimsey asked. Todd gestured to the paper. "Just the Colonel's old estate inventory. Valuables, heirlooms, that sort of thing. Dated 3 years ago." Wimsey scanned it quickly. Furniture, clocks, a set of Georgian decanters. Nothing stood out until— "Ah," he said. "Look. Here. Fireplace ornament, Italian 17th century, silver-mounted carved boxwood." "Gone?" Todd asked. "Quite. Nothing of the sort on the hearth now, nor any indication it was recently moved. No dust rings, no indentations. Either the—" Inventory is outdated or someone removed the object, Todd swore softly. Could it be valuable? Whimsy tilted his head. Possibly, or possibly significant in another way. Did the Colonel keep any record of visitors? Guest book in the hall. Together, they made their way to the front entry, where a battered green leather volume sat, on a pedestal. Todd flipped through, mumbling names. Bishop of Lyme, the vicar, Mr. Otley 3 weeks ago. Look at this. Mr. M. Langford, March 6th. That's 3 days ago. Do we know him? Not yet. I'll make inquiries. As Todd reached for the telephone, Whimsy strolled back toward the drawing room, where he sat down on the same horsehair settee the Colonel's body had once occupied. The silence in the room was different now, less ominous, more expectant, like a stage before the curtain lifts. He stared at the empty grate. Why would a man afraid of fire, afraid of dreams about fire, sit in a cold room, slippers on, hot water, bottle at his feet and die without struggle? And why had he left the fireplace untouched, yet allowed someone with a matchbook from a questionable Torquay hotel, to enter that sanctum? Because it wasn't untouched. The ashes proved that someone had been there. Someone had burned something, but not successfully. He stood suddenly, moving to the fireplace, and reached for the flue chain. It was stiff, but not rusted. He pulled, gently. A soft clink and a small rush of soot fell. He peered up inside, not empty. He fetched a pair of tongs from the hearth set and, with some delicacy, extracted a crumpled object from the back of the chimney throat. It was partially charred, damp from the sea air and soot-blackened, but still recognizable. The corner of an envelope. The address had been obliterated by flame, but inside, miraculously spared, a half-burned letter remained. The ink had run. In places, but a few phrases stood out. Cannot continue without consequences. Will not allow my inheritance to be usurped. Georgina has no claim. I have the original codicil. Whimsy exhaled slowly. Georgina. The missing niece. The theatrical. Not located, not uninvolved. And suddenly the old house, the missing ornament, the footsteps on the rose path, the fireplace that gave no heat, they all seemed to lean toward her name. He held the letter by the edge and read it once more. Whoever had tried to burn it had failed. Whoever had left it had assumed the fire would finish the task. But a fireplace that hadn't worked in years, blocked no doubt by some small obstruction, had refused to cooperate. A house, it seemed, could rebel against murder too, and Georgina Hales, wherever she was, had just become far more interesting. Lord. Peter Whimsy stood with the half-burnt letter dangling between his fingers, as though weighing the paper against the salt-laden air itself. The room had taken on a different quality now, not merely cold but watchful, as though the very furniture had turned its ears toward the fireplace and was waiting for him to speak the name again. Georgina. He read the salvaged phrases once more, committing them to memory. Cannot continue without consequences. Will not allow my inheritance to be usurped. Georgina has no claim. I have the original codicil. Codicil. Now there was a word to make a solicitor salivate and a niece go pale. He slipped the damaged letter into a waxed envelope and sealed it with a W-engraved ring that Harriet had once mockingly declared his seal of petty interference. Then he returned to the study. Todd looked up from the telephone, his expression sour. Hotel L'Estaminet confirms Mr. M. Langford registered for 2 nights. Checked out early yesterday morning. Paid in cash. Description: dark hair, medium. Build, clipped accent, smart suit. Could be anyone. But likely isn't, said Whimsy. And Georgina Hales. No record yet. If she's still touring, she's not doing it under her family name. I've got someone at the yard tracking. Theatrical companies in the region. Excellent. Whimsy set the envelope on the desk. Do be careful with that. I believe it may be the motive for everything. Todd's eyes narrowed. Something about the inheritance? Whimsy nodded. Colonel Hales was preparing to change his will, possibly disinheriting Georgina. This letter implies a confrontation. She or someone was present here recently. Someone tried to burn this letter in the drawing room hearth, apparently not realizing the chimney's been functionally useless for years. Todd frowned. So we think the colonel was shot to prevent the codicil from being signed. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was signed, and someone is now rather desperate to find and destroy it. Otley? Whimsy smiled thinly. If Otley benefits from the existing will and feared being cut out, then yes, he may have motive. But he would hardly bring a matchbook from a cheap hotel and leave it like a calling card. Georgina, on the other hand, may have wished to preempt her disinheritance. A theatrical nature often lends itself to melodramatic impulses. Fire, confrontation, revenge and all that. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young constable entered with a hesitant look. Inspector, there's a gentleman just arrived. Claims to be Mr. Otley. Says he had a standing invitation from Colonel Hales. Very insistent. Show him in, Todd said, straightening his jacket. Let's see what the man has to say. Frank Otley was a lean, weather-worn figure with greying temples and the sort of tailored overcoat that bespoke money, or at least the appearance of it. His handshake was firm, his smile not quite. Gentlemen, I came as soon as I heard. Is it true? Septimus dead? Shot? I'm afraid so, said Whimsy, watching him closely. Otley shook his head. God, I can't imagine it. Suicide? Hardly, Whimsy said lightly. Colonel Hales had recently ordered new boots and expressed interest in boiled ham. Not the behavior of a man preparing for the void. Todd cleared his throat. Mr. Otley, what was the nature of your relationship with Colonel Hales? Friends since the war, both in logistics, shared a taste for efficiency and old Scotch. We went into a few ventures together in the 40s. Never anything scandalous. He was, well, cautious. Did he mention his will to you? Yes. Said he was planning to amend it. Wanted to ensure certain elements of the family didn't interfere posthumously, as he put it. Did he say whom he intended to benefit? Otley hesitated. Not in so many words. I assumed one of the nieces. He wasn't fond of Georgina, thought her frivolous and too enamored of the stage, more inclined toward Amelia, sensible woman, married to a vicar, and you yourself. I'd assumed I was already included, in the existing will. He referred to me once as his executor in all but blood. I took it as a compliment. Whimsy smiled gently. You brought documents, I presume? Otley produced a thin folder from his satchel. The updated codicil. He asked me to draw it up. We were to review and sign it this weekend. Whimsy took it, flipped through quickly, and passed it to Todd. And if I may ask, he said, were you in contact with him earlier this week, Hasty? Spoke on Tuesday. He said he'd had a disturbing letter, wasn't specific, sounded shaken. Did he mention Georgina? Not directly. But he did say something about people reappearing from the woodwork. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. And where were you last night? Back in London. Attended a charity gala at the Institute of Engineers. I can provide names, please. To also? Whimsy said as if casually. Do you know a Mr. Langford? Otley frowned. Name rings a bell. An actor, maybe? Georgina mentioned him years ago. Said he was married to 2 masks, whatever that meant. Poetic, Whimsy murmured. Thank you, Mr. Otley. We'll let you know if we require anything further. Otley took his leave, and Whimsy waited until the door had clicked shut before speaking. Well, Todd, we now have motive, a timeline, a missing codicil, and a potential accomplice. You think Langford is real? I think someone stayed. Kin Torquay under that name, And that same someone stood in this drawing room with a lit match and a panic in their chest. Todd scratched his chin. Still no sign of Georgina. What's your next move? Whimsy looked out the window toward the sea. We find her. Theatricals leave trails, playbills, dressing room arguments, lovers with grudges. And in the meantime, he trailed off, eyes narrowing. Tell me, Todd, has anyone searched the old music room? Todd blinked. Music room? Yes. This house once had one. I noticed the floor plan while you were frowning over the tea. Together they crossed the hall and descended a narrow passage lined with fading family crests. The door to the music room stuck before opening with a reluctant sigh. Dust spiraled in the gloom. It was a long, narrow room with cracked paneling and warped floorboards. At its far end stood a disused pianoforte, a broken metronome, and oddly a folding screen. Whimsy walked straight to the screen. Behind it was a writing desk. On the desk, a sheet of paper, a photograph, a box. The paper was addressed to my executor. The photograph was of a young woman in stage costume, smiling with studied indifference. The box locked. Todd forced it open with a penknife. Inside, another letter dated last Thursday, and a smaller envelope marked Codicil Final. Well, said Whimsy, the fireplace may have failed its task, but the house seems to be keeping its secret safe. Until now. He held the codicil up to the light, confirming the signature. Now, he murmured, let's see who benefits and who's just lost their last chance at the inheritance. And somewhere, he felt certain, Georgina Hales had just begun to run out of exits. Inspector Todd turned the codicil over in his hands, with a reverence usually reserved for ancient relics or the final slice of Christmas pudding. His eyes traced each inked line like a detective of old uncovering a papyrus curse. No doubt about it, he muttered. Colonel Hales's signature, dated, witnessed, legal as a London rain. Which, said Lord Peter Whimsy, crossing the dusty music room to examine the desk again, rarely falls without drenching something inconvenient. He gestured toward the rest of the items. The photograph of the costumed woman, the executor's note, the letter with its already crumbling seal. Georgina Hales, Todd murmured, holding up the photograph. Must be. You can see the family, chin determined with undertones of defiance, mixed with theatrical panache and perhaps a touch of gin, said Whimsy. The costumes from the Duchess of Malfi, if I'm not mistaken. Jacobean tragedy, always fashionable among those drawn to melodrama and poison. Todd cracked the seal on the longer letter. Shall I? By all means. One must never turn down the final words of the recently murdered. Todd cleared his throat and began to read, to whom it may concern, and it concerns far too many. If you are reading this, I am either dead or in hiding, and the odds are very poor on the latter. This house has long been filled with shadows, some my own, some inherited. My intent was to set things to rights before the past devoured the present. Georgina was my brother's child, yes, but not mine in spirit. She is clever, but lacks restraint. I once caught her copying my signature at age 13, for a forged note to her headmistress, she claimed. I suspected even then her ambitions went further. She came to me 2 weeks ago with a story about desperation and artistic failure. She wanted money. I refused. She hinted at the existence of an earlier codicil unsigned which she had found among my papers. She demanded its validation. I told her I would draft a final codicil with my lawyer and nullify all previous iterations. She flew into one of her performances, said I would regret casting her out, that she had ways of ensuring her place in the family story. I thought it mere petulance. I may have been wrong. If this is read in a court of law, I reaffirm that my intentions, as expressed in the accompanying document, reflect my final wishes. I do not accuse anyone directly, but nor am I blind. Burn this if you must, but no. Fires do not erase everything. Some things smoulder. Todd finished in silence. Even the room seemed to hold its breath. Not quite a confession, he said finally, but close. Close enough, said Whimsy, kneeling to examine the dust around the desk. You see, only one set of recent footprints. The Colonel placed these items here himself. No one else has been in this room since. You're certain? Observe the dust, my dear Todd. The undisturbed top of the piano, the settled layer along the baseboard. The only disruption is a clear set of prints from the door to the desk and back again, made by house slippers, if I'm any judge. Todd scratched the back of his head. But if he went to the trouble of hiding this here, why not just post the codicil to his solicitor? But that would be too logical. No, I think this was a theatrical gesture of his own, a last attempt to outplay his niece at her own game. A locked box, a dramatic letter, a tucked-away codicil, it all smacks of curtain calls and final bows. But Georgina didn't find it. Precisely. She likely searched the drawing room, his study, perhaps even the bedroom, but not the music room. It's been disused for years, and she might not even have remembered it existed. A wager she assumed he'd hidden the codicil somewhere obvious. When she didn't find it, she resorted to panic and fire. And now, Todd said grimly, she's vanished. No, said Whimsy, rising and dusting his knees. She's merely taken the next stage direction. We just need to follow the script. They returned to the drawing room where the house's heavy silence pressed in again. Whimsy paused before the cold fireplace, eyeing the empty grate like an old adversary. She was here, he said softly. She stood right where we are, with the match in one hand and that letter in the other. Perhaps Langford stood behind. Her, perhaps not. Either way, she tried to destroy the evidence and fled when it wouldn't burn properly. Todd frowned. And the Colonel, asleep, already dead? I think not. I think he watched her. Possibly from the doorway. Possibly from the chair. She might have thought him asleep. Perhaps she realized too late. Perhaps the gun was already in her hand, or in his. There could have been a struggle. Or she returned later to finish what she started. So you think she shot him? I think someone did, said Whimsy, and she remains the most likely candidate. But the method is curious. No sign of a break-in. The door was locked from the inside, and yet she got out. Todd frowned. Secret passage? More likely sleight of hand. He lets her in, they talk. Something goes wrong. She shoots him. Then, before panic sets in, she takes the key from his pocket, locks the door from the inside, and climbs out the window. Relatches it from outside, easily, done with a hooked stick or even string. She's a stage manager. Such tricks are second nature. And the gun? Dropped in the sea, most likely, or taken by Langford if he exists. We'll know more once we find her. Todd nodded. We've issued a watch on local stations, coastal roads. I'll extend it to theatre troupes within 100 miles. I'd suggest you also check small repertory companies performing. Anything Jacobean. She may not be able to resist the symmetry. That evening, Whimsy returned to his temporary rooms at the Blue Hound Inn. It was a modest place, with thin walls and tea served in cracked porcelain, but the view from the window was unmatched. He stood there now, gazing at the sea as it heaved like an uneasy conscience. A knock came. He opened the door to find a boy in bicycle goggles, clutching a telegram. Georgina Haley's, spotted. Theatre Royal, Lyme Regis, touring with Malfi. Troupe performs tomorrow night, sending team. Whimsy allowed himself a rare smile. Of course, the Duchess returns to her stage. He dressed swiftly, then sat down to write a note to Harriet, whom he had trained never to worry unless he had begun quoting Don. He wrote instead, "Dear heart, theatricals abound. The fireplace has spoken, the codicil survived its immolation, and a duchess in exile is about to give her final performance. I intend to be in the front row. Your Peter." Then he stood, collected his hat and cane, and made for the station. Georgina Hales had chosen the stage as her alibi, her camouflage, and, if Lord Peter Wimsey had judged her rightly. Her confession. Now all that remained was to see whether she would stick to her script or improvise to the end. The Theatre Royal in Lyme Regis had the look of something bravely resisting the present day. Its facade, with its peeling gilt letters and sun-bleached posters, had once aspired to Georgian grandeur, but now leaned more towards seaside whimsy. On this particular evening, the box office advertised The Duchess of Malfi, performed by the Broadsword Touring Company, featuring one Georgie Hale as the Duchess herself. Lord Peter Wimsey stepped through the faded velvet curtain into the shadowy cool of the auditorium just as the house lights dimmed. He took a seat in the fourth row, not far from the aisle, close enough to read facial expressions, far enough to seem indifferent. A glance at the program confirmed what he already knew. Georgie Hale was Georgina Hales. The photograph, though, airbrushed and theatrical, showed the same arching brows and proud jaw as the portrait on Colonel Hales's mantelpiece. The curtain rose. The play began. Georgina entered halfway through the first act in a gown that shimmered with candlelit menace. Her voice was rich and precise, her bearing regal. She moved as one born to command attention, to direct the gaze. Wimsey watched her with a collector's interest, every movement calculated, every emotion sharp-edged but measured. This, he thought, was not a woman who merely played tragedy. This was a woman who had lived close to it and decided she preferred to conduct it from the wings. When the second act concluded, he rose and made his way through the quiet press of intermission-goers toward the stage door. A young man with a clipboard and the distracted air of someone about to misplace a sword prop looked up from his notes. "Can I help you?" "Lord Peter Wimsey, I'd like a brief word with Miss Hale after the performance. Tell her I've come from Dorset. She'll understand." The man blinked, clearly not used to nobility or coded messages. "I'll, pass it along." Wimsey nodded and returned to his seat, watching the rest of the play unfold with the appreciation of a man who knew that the real third act was still to come. Georgina died splendidly, bloodied in a crumpled heap, her final lines delivered with such mournful clarity that a woman in the next row sniffled audibly into her gloves. The curtain fell. Applause thundered. The company bowed. Georgina bowed last, her head inclined, not humble but solemn. She vanished into the wings. 10 minutes later she reappeared in the corridor behind the stage, her makeup half removed, a trench coat thrown over her costume. Her eyes scanned the dim hallway before fixing on Wimsey. "Well," she said coolly, "I rather expected you to arrive sooner. Did Amelia send you?" "No," said Wimsey. "The Fireplace did." She blinked once, then folded her arms. "Do come in, Lord Peter," she said, pushing open a door to a cramped dressing room. It smelled of cold cream and roses, with a faint overlay of grease paint and tension. "I see you've kept the name," he remarked, nodding to the makeup mirror where G. Hale was scrawled in white paint. "A tribute to obscurity," she replied. "Better to tour anonymously than be heckled as the Colonel's niece. Besides, it fits the Marquis better. You performed well tonight. Praise from Lord Wimsey. I shall preserve it in scent and resin. But I don't suppose you came here as a critic." "No," he said, taking the single chair. "I came as a witness to a crime, possibly two." She laughed softly. "Do all your accusations begin in a theatre? Only when the prime suspect insists on staging a Jacobean tragedy within a Golden Age mystery." Georgina moved to the mirror and began wiping off her lipstick. Her hand did not tremble. "So," she said, "what am I supposed to have done? You were seen at Grindleshaw. You were heard arguing with Colonel Hales. You had motive, inheritance, resentment, perhaps an old grudge or two. You attempted to burn a letter that implicated you. You were connected to a Mr. Langford who booked a hotel room under a false name and likely assisted in your removal. And most damningly, You performed beautifully the night after your uncle was found dead in his armchair, shot in the head in a locked room." She paused. "That's quite a script." "I've had worse material to work with," Whimsy replied, "and fewer willing performers. Tell me, was it worth it? The act, the fire, the panic?" "You're wrong, you know," she said, voice lower now. "I didn't kill him. Convince me. I went there, yes. He wrote and asked me to come, said he was making changes, wanted to say something face to face. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he said I was a parasite dressed as a performer. I almost didn't go. But you did." "I did. And it went as badly as I feared. He showed me the codicil, told me Amelia was to inherit everything, said I had made my bed in touring theatres and cheap hotels, said I was only ever interested in the money. And were you?" "I was interested in being seen," she said, "acknowledged. When I was a girl, he doted on Amelia, called her his future matron. I was the disappointment, the sideshow. And when he showed you the codicil, I begged him not to file it, said I'd accept a lesser share, anything. He laughed. Actually laughed. I left. I was furious, yes, but not homicidal. Langford had driven me, and he stayed in Torquay. I took the train back the next morning." "You broke into the drawing room." "I didn't break in. He used to hide things in the hearth. I thought maybe he'd had second thoughts and left something there. Some proof he hadn't hated me. And the fire. I tried to light one, to see if smoke would draw anything out. I'd seen him use that trick as a child. But the logs wouldn't catch. The grate was cold, clogged with soot. I panicked. I'd already stolen the letter. I didn't know if it said anything incriminating. I tried to burn it. It wouldn't go. I left it in the grate and ran." "But you didn't kill him?" "I swear it. He was alive when I left. Smug and unforgiving, but alive. I couldn't even find the codicil." Whimsy leaned back. "That's the problem, Georgina. You couldn't find it because he'd hidden it somewhere you'd never think to look." She turned, very still now. "You found it." "I did." Her breath caught. "Then I've lost everything." He shook his head. "Not everything. He didn't disinherit you entirely. You are to receive a modest trust, enough to continue your career without fear of starvation or melodrama." She laughed bitterly. "Is that what you think this was?" "A melodrama, I think," said Whimsy, "that your life has long been one, and that now you have the opportunity to choose realism instead." She stared at him for a long moment. "So what happens now?" "You return to Dorset. You make a statement. If your story matches the timeline and if Langford corroborates it, you'll be cleared of murder. Arson, however incompetent, may remain on the table, and if I refuse, then I find Langford myself and I ask him who fired the shot while the tide was high and the chimney was clogged and the key still warm in a dead man's pocket." She exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll come, but not tonight. Let me finish the performance." Whimsy nodded. Every performer deserves her final bow. And with that, Georgina Hales turned back to the mirror, drew a line of red across her lips and prepared to die once more. This time, on stage, where death left no stain and applause was the only consequence. Lord Peter Whimsy watched the second, half of the Duchess of Malfi unfold with fresh eyes, now acutely attuned to the emotional cadences beneath Georgina Hales's performance. There was something not quite theatrical in her despair now, something too raw, too finely shaded to be mere stagecraft. It was the difference between declaiming tragedy and embodying it. When the curtain fell, she did not emerge for a final. Instead, a young assistant stepped awkwardly before the audience and announced that Miss Hale had taken ill during the final act and would not be greeting guests. The crowd murmured, some disappointed, others theatrically sympathetic, and filtered into the damp Lyme Regis night. But Whimsy didn't leave. He was already backstage, waiting by the dressing room door. When Georgina emerged, coat already on and stage makeup scrubbed to a pale wash, her face was composed, resigned. "You've brought the police?" she asked, her voice low. "I've brought a motor car," said Whimsy. "Inspector Todd is waiting." "In Dorchester. We'll go at your pace." She looked at him, genuinely startled. "Why?" "Because I'm not entirely certain you're the villain of this piece." "You don't believe me," she said, with the familiar bitterness of someone well rehearsed in not being believed. "I don't believe in neat stories," said Whimsy, "especially when they rhyme too easily with the obvious." They drove in silence for some time, headlights cutting long swathes through the twisting coastal roads. Whimsy drove well, but not hurriedly. Georgina stared ahead, the collar of her coat turned up, her fingers pressed tightly in her lap. It was she who spoke first. "There's something you haven't told me." "Oh? You said he laughed when I begged him to reconsider. But he wasn't a laughing man, Lord Whimsy. You've read his letters, I'm sure. He was exacting, not cruel. Something about that detail. It was added. I never said he laughed." Whimsy did not look at her. His voice remained light. "And what do you deduce?" "That you spoke to someone else. Someone who told you their version of events, perhaps someone who was there." "Go on," said Whimsy. She turned to him now, eyes narrowing. "You've known, haven't you, that someone else was there after?" "I left." Whimsy nodded. "I suspected, but now I'm certain." Georgina's voice, when it came, was smaller. "Langford didn't come in with me. I lied about that. He stayed outside in the car. He was asleep when I returned. He never saw the Colonel." "Then it wasn't him either," Whimsy murmured, "which leaves us with a question of timing." They reached Grindleshaw Grange just past 1 in the morning. The house, shrouded in coastal fog, loomed like an accusation in plaster and stone. Inspector Todd was already there, waiting with 2 uniformed constables and a cup of what was presumably tea, though Whimsy hoped for their sake it wasn't Mrs. Thripp's. "Evening, Miss Hales," Todd said, not unkindly. "Thank you for returning." Georgina nodded. "You have questions. I have time." "We all do," said Whimsy, "until we run out of it." They took her into the drawing room, now bereft of its corpse, but still heavy with aftermath. The fireplace remained, untouched, the ashes quietly accusing. Whimsy moved to the hearth and crouched beside it once more. "I want you to look at this," he said. "Not the ashes, those you know, but the hearthstone itself." Georgina joined him somewhat stiffly. "Notice anything odd?" he asked. She frowned. "There's a line, a hairline crack." "Exactly. A fissure that shouldn't be there. Not if this was just a decorative hearth. And yet no soot around the edges, no blackening. Nothing to suggest it's been opened or disturbed in decades." She looked puzzled. "What's your point?" Whimsy stood. "My point, Miss Hales, is that your uncle didn't just hide things in drawers. He hid things under floors. That fissure leads to a concealed compartment. We found the remains of a small case inside, a felt-lined cavity with space for a pistol." Todd nodded. "Empty now. The gun wasn't thrown into the—" "See?" Whimsy continued. "It was hidden here after the fact." Georgina took a step back. "But I didn't—" "No," said Whimsy. "You didn't. But someone else did. Someone with intimate knowledge of this room. Someone who had access after your departure. Someone trusted, almost invisible." Todd stiffened. "You mean—" Whimsy turned. "Mrs. Thripp." There was a silence in the room, deeper than before. Georgina shook her head. "That's ridiculous. She was practically the furniture, always muttering about dampen manners." "Precisely," said Whimsy. "She's been in this house for 30 years, knew the Colonel's habits, knew how to disappear, and more importantly, had the opportunity." Todd stood. "But motive?" Whimsy moved toward the desk where the Colonel's papers had been. "Sorted. She wasn't merely a housekeeper. She was also his cousin, once removed, illegitimate daughter of his uncle, according to a side note in the Colonel's private memoirs." Not widely known, but she knew. Georgina blinked. He wouldn't acknowledge her, she asked. He employed her, housed her, likely considered it sufficient. Todd exhaled. So when she realized he was cutting Georgina out, she panicked, said Whimsy. She found the new codicil either by accident or design, knew it would remove her by implication, any chance of continuing at the Grange, of keeping her quiet stability. Perhaps she even saw it as injustice. After Georgina left, she entered the room, found the Colonel sleeping or not. A confrontation occurred. She took the pistol from the drawer, shot him at close range, and knowing the house's secrets, hid the weapon in the hearth. Georgina sat down hard. My God! Whimsy's voice was very quiet. And then, when she heard someone had tried and failed to destroy the letter in the fireplace, she took the opportunity to fan the flames of suspicion. Todd nodded grimly. We'll bring her in, quietly. Georgina looked up at Whimsy. So, I've been the villain of her story all along. You played the part she wrote for you, he said gently, but the curtain falls now. It took only hours for the confession to come. Mrs. Thrip, when confronted, did not weep. She did. Not rage. She sat in the study with her hands folded on her lap and said, He said he was going to send me away, after all these years, said I had no claim. I was here before he ever brought in that painted little chit from the stage. But it was always Amelia and Georgina, always. Even after everything I kept quiet, and then she stopped speaking. Later, with the dawn edging up over the sea like a memory long denied, Whimsy stood once more by the cold fireplace. You were right, Georgina, said, coming to stand beside him. About many things, be more specific. I did play tragedy too well. I let myself think I could act my way into someone's legacy. You acted your way out of suspicion, he said. That's no small feat. She smiled faintly. So what happens now? You inherit what was left for you, he said, and perhaps earn the rest. She looked at the ashes in the grate. I never meant for it to end like this, and no one ever does, said Whimsy. That's what makes it real. They stood in silence a moment longer, while the sun slipped quietly into the empty room and touched the edge of the hearth. Finally, and at last, bringing a little warmth. The formal arrest of Mrs. Thrip was conducted with all the theatrical restraint of a Greek chorus in mourning. Inspector Todd, possessing the dignity of a man who had once lost a shoelace during a murder trial and vowed never to be caught unready again, handled it without fuss. The old housekeeper said little. Her face betrayed neither regret nor relief. If anything, she seemed slightly disappointed that the lie had unraveled so soon. She was never meant to die for it, Whimsy murmured afterward, as they watched the police car disappear into the mist. She merely played the part written, by bitterness, not by malice. And as is often the case in domestic tragedies, the blood was spilled not for money but for place, for permanence, for the comfort of remaining undisturbed. Georgina Hales said nothing. She stood at the window of Grindleshaw Grange, arms folded, staring at the sea. Her hair was pinned back now, her makeup scrubbed away. In the grey morning light, she looked more like the girl she must have been once, and less like the actress who had commanded death scenes for applause. She must have hated me, she said finally. To set me up that way. Not hate, Whimsy replied. She feared change. You were change incarnate. And my uncle? Your uncle loved order and feared being thought ungrateful. He made no provision for Mrs. Thrip because he did not believe in debts of sentiment. In doing so, he left her nothing but a grievance. Georgina turned from the window. I should go, she said. The troop will be wondering what became of me. Let them wonder, Whimsy said lightly. You've earned a few days of mystery. She hesitated. You don't think I should stay? Face Amelia? The lawyers? The will? Do you want to? No, she admitted. But it feels unfinished. It always does, he said. The curtain falls, the lights go up, and everyone leaves, still clutching their programs, trying to remember who played the bishop in Act 2. Real life rarely offers a neat epilogue. She smiled, though faintly. "You always speak like a man who's seen too much and pretends otherwise." "I am precisely that," he said, "though I find it makes dinner parties awkward." They walked together down the hall. The house seemed subtly altered, emptier, yet lighter. Without the Colonel's brooding presence, without Mrs. Thripp's unspoken jurisdiction, the Grange had lost its tension. It was, for the first time in years, just a house, one that had swallowed secrets for decades, and now found itself slightly overfull. "You'll inherit your portion soon enough," Whimsy said as they reached the door. "Not much, but enough for fresh beginnings, perhaps even a new production. The Duchess Redeemed. I was never meant to play heroines," she said. "Then invent one," Whimsy replied. "That's what theatre is for." They parted with a handshake, firm without sentiment, and Whimsy watched her drive away in a hired car, the back window reflecting a coastline heavy with morning haze. He turned back to the Grange, where Todd was waiting in the study, sorting through papers with the resigned air of a man who knew that justice always arrived hand in hand with paperwork. "She's off then?" Todd asked. "For now." "You believe her?" "I do," Whimsy said. She lied about Langford, yes, but not about the rest. Her story rang with the peculiar tone of reluctant truth. Besides, her kind of guilt would have curdled on stage. That last performance, that wasn't a woman who'd committed murder. That was a woman who'd stood near enough to it to know its shape. Todd sighed and set down a folder. "You always make it sound so literary." "It is," said Whimsy. "Crime, I mean, murder, it's never about the act. It's about the emotion that leads up to it, and the silence that follows." They sat for a moment in the quiet study. The fireplace here had once been lit, long ago. Whimsy could see the faint scarring on the floorboards, the ghost of ash, patterns. He stood and crossed to the bookshelves, running a finger along the spines. Most were unread, some had never been opened. Colonel Hales lived with a very particular kind of austerity, Whimsy said. He prized duty, not affection. He stored sentiment the way some men store cigars, untouched but carefully inventoried. "He paid the price for that," said Todd. "We all do," Whimsy replied, "in coin or in kind." He extracted a thin volume bound in brown cloth. "On the Disposition of Estates, a Gentleman's Guide." Inside the cover, in the Colonel's spidery script, was a note. "Property is the only legacy that outlives character." Whimsy replaced the book and turned to Todd. "What will become of the Grange?" "The trustees will put it in trust, I imagine. Let Amelia's husband manage the land, see to the tenants. Georgina will get her settlement. And Otley, well, he'll walk away with nothing but a bruised ego and a very interesting dinner anecdote. And Mrs. Thripp? She'll serve time," Todd said. "Though not much, I'd wager. Solicitor will argue diminished responsibility, age, long-standing emotional strain. Jury will be sympathetic. The press will enjoy it. Housekeeper's desperate act, that sort of thing. She'll become a cautionary footnote," said Whimsy, another ghost in the Grange. That afternoon, Whimsy walked the rows, path one final time. The prints from earlier had vanished, erased by the wind and sea spray. The roses themselves were just beginning to stir toward bloom, their thorns sharp, their buds tight with the promise of color not yet revealed. At the cliff's edge, he stopped and looked out at the waves. They crashed without ceremony, without narrative, indifferent, like time itself. In the end, there had been no supernatural fire, no curse, no madness induced by dreaming flames. Just the cold silence of long-held resentment and the slow ignition of fear. And yet he could not quite forget the fireplace. The ashes that hadn't burned, the match that wouldn't light, the stubborn grate that preserved what it was meant to destroy. It wasn't fate, it wasn't magic, but it had been in its own quiet way justice. He pulled out his cigarette case, hesitated, then put it away. "Not today," he said aloud to the sea. You've had enough fire. He walked back toward the house where Inspector Todd was already packing the last of the files, and the door to the drawing room stood ajar, letting in the breeze, and with it the faint smell of salt and roses. And something more elusive, not smoke, something lighter, freedom perhaps, or simply fresh air. The following morning broke over Dorset with a kind of wan apology, pale sunlight filtering meekly through the coastal clouds, as though hesitant to cast light on a house where secrets had so recently been exhumed. Grindle. Shaw Grange stood unbothered by the revelation of its darkest corners. Old houses, Lord Peter Wimsey thought, were like old men. The ones with the most scars tended to creak the least. He took breakfast alone in the upstairs study, a habit formed, partly out of necessity, and partly out of distaste for dining among too many metaphors, a pot of tea that could charitably be described as ambitious, a rack of toast and a single boiled egg. Wimsey considered it a meagre feast for a day which would require the last unflinching act of performance. He had arranged, after some necessary manipulation of Inspector Todd's sensibilities, for Amelia Throssell, the elder niece and vicar's wife, to arrive at the Grange that morning. She had, according to Todd's report, fainted neatly upon learning the details of her uncle's murder, and been revived by smelling salts and indignation. Wimsey had not yet met her, but he imagined a woman composed of starch and sacrifice, high-collared and low-voiced, who would quote the Psalms to her butcher and keep a tally of other people's failings beneath her prayer-book ribbon. At precisely 10:30, a motor car arrived on the gravel. Wimsey observed its approach from the upper landing, with the satisfaction of a man watching a pawn reach the 8th square. The woman who stepped out was indeed, as he imagined, black-gloved, iron-spined, and accompanied by an umbrella that looked as though it had been trained in swordsmanship. She was shown into the drawing-room and stood stiffly, as though expecting an accusation to leap out from behind the curtains. Wimsey followed her in, noting the very subtle tremor in her posture, a tightness around the mouth that suggested not grief, but the quiet fury of a woman unconsulted. "Mrs. Throssell," he said, bowing. "I am Lord Peter Wimsey." "I know who you are," she replied, her tone precise. "You are the one who has cast Georgina into suspicion and scandal, though I dare say she needed little assistance." Wimsey smiled faintly. "And yet she is not the guilty party." Amelia's lips thinned. "No doubt you have developed some modern theory I do not hold with psychoanalysis. It always seems to blame the wrong person." "In this case," said Wimsey, "the wrong person has for once been exonerated. Your cousin, Mrs. Thrip, has confessed." Amelia blinked. "Mrs. Thrip? The housekeeper?" "The same. It appears that resentment, when left untended, is rather like damp. It spreads through the foundations and eventually causes collapse. I never liked her," Amelia said almost absently. "She always smelled of starch and moral superiority." "That may be the first accurate psychological profile ever produced by a member of the clergy's extended family," said Wimsey. "Do sit down." She did so primly. "And Georgina? She will now claim her share of the estate? She will receive what was allotted her in the revised codicil, your uncle's final and legal will, as will you." Amelia folded her hands. "That girl has never wanted responsibility. She squanders whatever she's given." "Possibly," said Wimsey, "but it is not for us to withhold legacy based on poor taste in plays or lipstick." Amelia said nothing for a moment. Then, more quietly, "He never consulted me." "About the will?" "No," said Wimsey. "He feared interference. He was my last blood relative. After everything, after I married a poor vicar and kept the family name respectable, he turns around and gives part of his estate to a woman who performed Salome in a tent outside Cheltenham." "Regrettable indeed," said Wimsey, "but not criminal." And it is not quite the end of the story. Amelia looked up sharply. Oh? There is one small matter left unresolved. A trifle, really. But it interests me. Go on. Whimsy rose and moved toward the fireplace. The ashes had been carefully preserved, the hearth untouched since the investigation began. On the night of your uncle's death, Whimsy said, someone entered this room after the murder had occurred. Not Georgina, not Mrs. Thrip. A third party. Amelia's breath caught just faintly. You see, Whimsy went on, Mrs. Thrip's confession accounted for the killing and the hidden weapon. Georgina accounted for the burned letter. But one match was used from a matchbook found here, and yet the fire was never lit. That match burned something else. He turned slowly. Amelia Throstle's expression did not change, but her hands tightened around the handle of her umbrella. You came here the next morning, Whimsy said softly. You let yourself in with the old gardener's key, he's very fond of you, by the way, and found your uncle already dead. You looked for the new codicil. You didn't find it, but you found the letter Georgina had tried to burn. You struck a match, tried to destroy it again. But the hearth was stubborn. The draught failed. The ashes remained. Amelia stood abruptly. That is conjecture. It is deduction, said Whimsy. Confirmed by the faint trace of your perfume on the page we recovered, something between violets and sanctimony. I'd wager your alibi, should we dig, will be conveniently vague for the hours between 7 and 9 the morning after your uncle's death. Do you mean to accuse me of something? She asked, voice cold now. No, said Whimsy, I mean to warn you. You attempted to destroy evidence. You concealed the presence of a key, both minor offenses legally. But morally they speak volumes. Amelia said nothing. Her silence was not guilt, it was calculation. I shall speak to no one of it, Whimsy said, provided you do not contest the will, provided you allow Georgina her due, and provided, most of all, you leave this house and never return. Her chin lifted. You mean to give her the Grange? No. The trustees will retain ownership, but she will have use of the house, for her company, for her art, for whatever absurdity she deems suitable. It will never again be a house of secrets. It will be loud and ridiculous and sometimes even joyful. Amelia looked at him with something that might have been hatred, or perhaps simply defeat. You believe she deserves this? No, said Whimsy, but I believe you do. Not. She swept past him without another word. The door closed behind her like a curtain falling on a particularly difficult character. Whimsy remained in the drawing-room for a time, watching the fireless hearth, listening to the stillness. He thought of the Colonel, so precise, so controlling, and of the way that all his order had unravelled the moment he tried to impose it too tightly. Of Georgina, who had sought love and received suspicion, of Mrs. Thrip, who had lived invisibly and died for being noticed too late, and of Amelia, who had spent a life doing all the right things and found that no one cared when she did the wrong. 1. A house is not just bricks and beams. It is memory, grief, ambition, pettiness and longing, all papered over with civility and warm scones. The Grange had survived its ghosts, but only barely. Later that evening, Whimsy packed his valise, tipped the housemaid who had returned after the dust settled, and wrote a final letter. My dearest Harriet, the mystery has been laid to rest, though not every soul here has. Fires fail, but resentment rarely does. A woman has her house, another has her silence, and I have a distaste for ash that I cannot quite shake. I shall see you soon. Perhaps with roses. He placed the letter in the post and walked into the dusk, cane tapping, hat low. The Grange remained behind him, silent, chilled, and finally ever so faintly beginning to warm. The following week passed with quiet inevitability. The newspapers had their brief spasm of titillation. Vicar's niece in velvet scandal, housekeeper's bullet ends Dorset dynasty, Fireplace hid murder clue, and then moved on to fresher tragedies, preferably with royal overtones, or local cricket scandals. Lord Peter Wimsey did not read them, or if he did, he made no remark. His interest in the affairs of Grindleshaw Grange had moved past mere curiosity. It was not often that a murder left behind so many survivors. He returned one final time to the Grange on a Thursday morning, just as the spring wind came inland, with the scent of salt and the promise of rain. The house was not quite as it had been. Something subtle had shifted, nothing physical but a difference in energy, as if the structure had been permitted to exhale. The curtains were open now. A radio played faintly in a back room. The silence was no longer suspicious. It was simply a pause between chapters. Georgina met him in the old conservatory, which had been thoroughly cleaned and repurposed into a makeshift rehearsal space. Folding chairs stood in a semicircle. A typewriter rested on a trestle table, flanked by copies of Macbeth, Arms and the Man, and a new script titled Salt and Ash, a tragedy in 3 acts. "I should have known you'd turn the murder into a play," Wimsey remarked, setting his hat on a chair. "It's not about the murder," Georgina said. "It's about the house and about a woman who thought she could disappear between the bricks. Mrs. Thrip as tragic heroine?" "As tragic mechanic," Georgina corrected. "She doesn't drive the plot. She holds it together until the whole thing collapses on top of her." Wimsey looked around. "And your troupe? They approve of the venue?" "They adore it. It's drafty and unpredictable and slightly haunted. We've already broken 3 teacups and 1 director's heart." He smiled. "Then all is as it should be." She poured tea stronger than before, and offered him a slice of cake that had the rough sincerity of being homemade. No more dainty hotel pastries. She had perhaps unconsciously begun to live like a person who was going to stay. "Do you believe me now?" she asked suddenly. "That I never meant to kill him?" "I believed you before," Wimsey said. "I only doubted whether you knew what you were doing when you struck the match." She looked down at her cup. "I didn't. You were frightened, desperate, angry. And now you've inherited a place you once ran from. That's a form of justice, though not always the kind that fits neatly into law." Georgina stood and crossed to the window, arms folded. "I keep thinking of Mrs. Thrip, what she must have felt walking back through this house after it was done, dusting his shelves, boiling water, knowing what lay behind the hearthstone. She thought she'd earned peace, and when it was threatened, she mistook silence for virtue." "She wasn't the only one," Georgina murmured. Wimsey tilted his head. "You mean Amelia?" "She wrote me a letter," Georgina said. "Said she wouldn't contest the will. Said she hoped I'd use the house wisely, and that I'd remember where I came from." "And will you?" "Every time the kettle boils, I imagine." They both smiled, but it was a subdued moment, neither mocking nor mournful, the kind of smile one gives to a former version of oneself. Outside, a new gardener was trimming the rose path. The old one had retired, a neat finality written into the soil. Wimsey rose and walked to the French doors, opening them slightly to let in the sound of birds and distant sea. "I suppose it's done now," Georgina said, following him. "No murder is ever entirely done," Wimsey replied. "It ripples, outward and inward. But yes, your uncle rests, your cousin is silent, the law is satisfied. For most stories, that is the end. But not for you." He gave her a thoughtful look. "The detective rarely gets an ending. He simply closes the book and waits for the next cry in the dark." She turned toward him. "Would you ever give it up? Detecting? Living among other people's tragedies?" Wimsey considered. "No," he said at last. "Because it's not just tragedy, it's clarity. stripping the world of its lies, one crime at a time. I don't do it for justice, I do it for the truth. And what's the truth here? That your uncle died because he failed to see people as more than roles. That Mrs. Thripp killed him because she couldn't bear being forgotten. That Amelia tried to erase you because she'd already erased herself. And you are still writing yourself into the story. She didn't speak for a long moment. Would you have arrested me if you hadn't believed in my innocence? I would have regretted it terribly, he said. But yes. She looked at him then, not with affection, but with understanding. You'd be a difficult man to live with. An impossible one, he said, which is why I only live with women who prefer poetry to conversation. They walked down the rose path together, toward the edge of the cliff. The wind had picked up slightly, tugging at Georgina's coat and flapping Whimsy's collar like an exclamation point. The sea was calm today, its surface gleaming like wet slate. A gull wheeled overhead, indifferent as only gulls can be, and say, "He ever loved me?" she asked suddenly. "My uncle?" "Yes," Whimsy said, "but not well." She nodded, satisfied. "I think I can live with that." He checked his watch, then his cane, then his hat. "I must be off. Harriet expects me to return before I've acquired another stray actress or heirloom pistol. You'll visit." "Only when I require dramatic monologues and strong tea." They paused by the gate. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing past the script." "Miss Hales," he said, bowing slightly, "I've never trusted." The obvious plot. And then he turned, walking down the gravel path with the sea behind him and the house receding into history. As he disappeared down the lane, the bells of the village church began to chime. Not for mourning, not for celebration, simply beautifully because it was noon, and at Grindleshaw Grange the hearth remained cold, but the windows were open, and the stage was set for a new act. Lord Peter Whimsy stood once more in the drawing room of Grindleshaw Grange, just as the sun prepared to dip its golden quill into the horizon and scrawl the final line across the sea. The light slanted in through the long windows, catching the silver on the andirons and limning the dust motes in lazy spirals. The fire, still and empty, no longer whispered of secrets. It had spoken. The house had listened. Inspector Todd sat, nearby in one of the worn wingbacks, thumbing through a copy of the Times but not truly reading. It was the kind of stillness that followed a storm, not relief exactly, but the hush of spent energy, of aftermath. Whimsy stirred his tea without drinking it. "Strange business. Todd," he said finally. "They always are with you," Todd replied, managing a thin smile. "But there's something about this one. It was never meant to be a spectacle. No crime of passion, no reckless greed, just a slow erosion of silence, built layer by layer until it crumbled under the weight of its own repression." Todd nodded. Mrs. Thripp believed she'd earned her place. She had. But people often mistake gratitude for obligation. Haley's believed that keeping her on was benevolence enough. He failed to see the emotional arithmetic she was doing, adding years of service and subtracting recognition. And Amelia? Whimsy leaned back, Amelia calculated. She always had. Her sin wasn't the crime, but the cover-up. She didn't murder him, but when she found the body, she saw an opportunity to rewrite her place in the will's shadow. She never expected the fireplace to betray her. Fireplaces don't usually play such a dramatic role. No, but this one refused to burn, a stubborn relic of a dying order. Quite poetic, really. Todd looked over the top of the paper. "And Miss Hales?" "She'll turn the Grange into a theatre, of course," Whimsy said. "I give it 6 months before a reviewer describes the estate as a blisteringly ironic setting for repurposed grief." "You sound amused." Sham, the best murders end in repurposing. When the place of death becomes a place of living again, it feels almost redemptive." Todd stood and walked to the window. "You'll be leaving then?" "In the morning. Harriet's been patient, but she'll suspect I've been consorting with actresses and fireplaces again. And have you? Only in moderation. Todd turned. There's just one thing that still bothers me. Oh? The gun. You said Mrs. Thrip hid it in the fireplace cavity. But how did she know it was there? Why not dispose of it entirely? Whimsy smiled slowly. Ah, the final chord. He stood and crossed to the hearth, crouching down and placing a hand against the side panel. Then, with a press and a slight twist, a segment of the stone slid inward with a dull clack. A mechanism, he said, installed decades ago, back when Colonel Hales's father ran the house. A gentleman with a taste for concealment. The fireplace wasn't merely decorative. It was functional in ways most never suspected. Todd stared. You mean... Thrip knew because she had cleaned this room for decades. She may have discovered it years before. She knew the fireplace's secrets better than the Colonel himself, and when she needed a place to hide something, she chose the one place no one else could find. Todd exhaled. And we would never have looked, had you not noticed the ash pattern, which was, if I may say so, rather beautifully inconsistent with a true attempt at burning. He stood again. Mrs. Thrip killed him not in rage, but in desperation. Georgina fumbled a cover-up, not a murder. Amelia tried to erase a piece of paper, and all of it unraveled because a chimney refused to draw. Strange how a match that doesn't light can be more revealing than one that does, Todd murmured. Whimsy grinned. Most truths are like that. Smoulder quietly in corners, refuse to catch until the right breath stirs them. They stood in silence for a long moment, the fireless hearth between them. Outside, a gull shrieked, unbothered. Somewhere in the house, Georgina's actors rehearsed a scene in which a duchess faced betrayal with dignity and a well-placed dagger. Whimsy picked up his hat. Well, Todd, the players are cast, the curtain has fallen, and the final applause belongs to the dead. I've nothing left here but ghosts and toast crumbs. Todd offered his hand. Until the next mystery. Whimsy shook it with a nod. Next time, he said, let's hope for something simple. A jewel theft, a forged signature, a missing cat, and no fireplaces. No fireplaces, Whimsy agreed solemnly. Or at least none that give no heat and too many answers. He stepped out into the wind, the sea to his left, the house behind him, and the path ahead. And as he walked, he hummed softly, a tune, from the Duchess of Malfi, half-remembered and just off-key, like a memory that doesn't quite belong to you. Behind him, Grindleshaw Grange stood in silhouette, a house no longer haunted, but finally and firmly